It all started on a quiet Tuesday morning. I had just pulled into my office parking spot, coffee in hand, ready to get a head start on a few client calls. Everything felt normal till I noticed a woman pacing near the entrance, phone pressed to her ear, glaring straight at me like I had trespassed on government property. Within minutes, a police cruiser pulled up. That's when things went from strange to downright unbelievable. The woman turned out to be the president of a nearby HOA, one that doesn't even cover my office building. She claimed I wasn't allowed to park there. I calmly explained that not only do I rent my office legally, I actually own the entire complex. Every unit, every parking space. But she wouldn't hear it. She waved a clipboard around like it was a badge, insisting her HOA rules applied to the entire street. I reminded her this was private commercial property completely separate from her residential neighborhood. Still, she kept pushing. She told the cops I was in violation of their community standards. I asked her what community. The officer seemed just as confused as I was, flipping through her paperwork while trying to keep the situation calm. Meanwhile, a few of my tenants started peeking out of their office windows, watching the whole scene unfold. What really threw me off was the confidence she had. She truly believed she had the authority to enforce rules here. But when the officer asked for proof of jurisdiction, things started to unravel. At that point, I realized this wasn't just some simple mix-up. There was something deeper going on, something she wasn't telling anyone. And just when I thought it couldn't get any more bizarre, she made a demand that left everyone speechless. You won't believe what happened next. She pointed at my building and, with a straight face, told the officer she wanted access to inspect 4 code violations. I actually laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of joke. But she wasn't joking. She claimed that since the complex was within visual distance of her HOA boundary, she had the right to enforce her community's appearance, rules including the type of signage on my door, the plants outside, and even where the trash bins were placed. I was stunned. The officer looked over at me like he didn't know whether to roll his eyes or start writing a report. I calmly explained again that this is a privately owned office complex with its own legal zoning and property lines, completely separate from her HOA. I even offered to pull up the deed and property records right then and there. But she wasn't interested in facts. She was on a mission. Turns out, she'd had her eye on this complex for months. A few weeks earlier, one of my tenants had hung a small vinyl banner in the window, advertising a weekend event. Totally within our building guidelines, but apparently she saw it and filed a complaint. That's when she started digging. And now, here she was, trying to take things into her own hands, with the police as her backup. My phone buzzed. It was one of the other unit owners texting me from inside, saying this woman had already come by twice last week, snooping around when no one was there. I hadn't thought much of it before, just another nosy neighbor, I figured. But now, it felt a lot more serious. Her tone, her insistence, even the way she spoke to the officer. It felt like she believed she actually owned a piece of this place. And then she pulled a folder from her bag, one that had my name on it. She flipped open the folder like she had just uncovered some grand conspiracy. Inside were printed screenshots of my company website, photos of my car, and blurry images of the complex from what looked like a zoom lens. She handed them to the officer like they were classified documents. "This man is operating outside of our guidelines," she said firmly. "He's disturbing the harmony of our community." I was floored. This wasn't about a sign or a parking spot anymore. This was personal. The officer gave me a questioning look, clearly uncomfortable. With how far she was taking this, I tried to keep my cool, but something about that folder didn't sit right with me. Why did she have photos of my private property? Why was she tracking me? Then one of the tenants, Jen from the design studio next door, came outside. She'd heard enough and decided to speak up. "She's harassed us too," Jen said. Week she came in and told my clients they were violating visitor limits, were not even part of her neighborhood, that seemed to catch the officer's attention. Still, the HOA lady Karen, I'd later learn her name didn't back down. She insisted she had community support and that she was simply doing her duty to maintain the aesthetic and professional standards of the area. I asked her plainly if she could show a single document giving her legal authority over our complex. She said, "It's implied through adjacency." That phrase echoed in my head. Implied through adjacency. That's not how property law works, but it gave me a chill. Was she just misinformed, or was there something more calculated going on? And then Jen whispered to me, "You should check your lease agreements." There's talk she's trying to lobby the city council for a zoning merge. That's when things really started to make sense, get a whole lot more dangerous after Jen's warning about the city council. A knot tightened in my stomach. I knew I had to act fast, but I wasn't sure where to start. The HOA president, Karen, wasn't just some overbearing neighbor anymore. She seemed to have a plan, one that could threaten everything I'd built in this office complex. I began digging through my lease documents and property records late into the night, hoping to find any loophole she could exploit. The deeper I went, the more I realized just how vulnerable this situation was. The next day, Karen showed up again, this time with a handful of people I hadn't seen before, a few residents from her HOA and someone who looked like a lawyer. They circled the building, snapping photos and taking notes as if preparing for a legal battle. I confronted her at the entrance, asking what this was about, but she just smiled coldly and said, "We're making sure the community standards are enforced." Her words felt like a warning, not a request. Meanwhile, the police officers who had come before seemed reluctant to get involved again, caught between an HOA trying to flex power and me standing my ground with legal ownership. It was a standoff that could escalate quickly if anyone pushed too hard. Then things got worse. A notice appeared on the front door, an official-looking letter claiming the building was under review for violations related to signage, parking, and even landscaping. It was signed by a city department I'd never heard of, and the timing couldn't have been worse. I felt like the walls were closing in. I reached out to a property lawyer, but even they warned that HOA disputes mixed with city codes could drag on for months, draining time and money. I was caught in a battle I hadn't asked for, with an opponent who refused to back down just when I thought I had a handle on the situation. Karen dropped her biggest bombshell yet. She threatened to call 911, again not over parking this time, but claiming I was conducting unauthorized business activities on the premises. That threat left me speechless. What could she possibly mean by that? And what would happen if the police actually responded? The tension was at its peak, and the next move would change everything. Just as I was trying to process her latest threat, my phone rang. It was one of the tenants, sounding panicked. "You need to get here now. The police are outside again, and this time they're acting on her complaint." My heart sank. I rushed out, wondering what kind of unauthorized business activities Karen could have reported that would justify a police visit. When I arrived, the scene was worse than I imagined. 2 officers stood by the front door, and Karen was there too, holding what looked like a formal complaint. But then something caught my eye, a third person, someone I hadn't seen before, slipping quietly behind the building. Curious, I followed, and found a city inspector examining the property without any notice to me or the other owners. It wasn't just a random inspection. It looked coordinated, almost planned. I confronted the inspector, who admitted under pressure that Karen had filed multiple anonymous complaints over the past few months. Complaints that triggered this surprise inspection. Suddenly, I realized the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a power struggle between neighbors. Karen had weaponized the system, using city agencies and law enforcement as tools to push me out. The tension escalated when I overheard Karen telling the officers she had a community mandate to ensure no unauthorized activities were happening in my office complex. But what exactly did she mean by unauthorized? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud as the city inspector took notes. The officers asked for my business permits and zoning documents. I handed them over, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Karen's actions had blurred the lines between HOA rules and official city enforcement, dragging me into a legal nightmare I never saw coming. And just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, my attorney called with news that shook me to my core. There might be an old clause buried deep in the property deed, something no one had mentioned before that could give the HOA some claim over parts of the complex. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just about parking or signage anymore. It was about ownership, control, and possibly losing everything. I knew I had to act fast before Karen's complaints turned into something legally binding. I gathered all my paperwork, the deeds, zoning permits, lease agreements, and met with my attorney to prepare a strong defense. We dug through every document, every clause, until finally we found the truth. That old clause was actually a mistake in the paperwork, something that was never properly recorded or enforced. It held no legal power, meaning Karen and her HOA had no claim over the complex at all. Armed with this evidence, I went back to the city officials and the police department. I laid out everything clearly: ownership rights, zoning laws, and the invalidity of the HOA's supposed authority. Slowly, the pressure started to lift. The surprise inspections stopped, and the officers stopped showing up to question me or my tenants. It felt like I had finally cleared the storm. But the biggest moment came when Karen was confronted by the city council during a public meeting. She tried to push her case, but officials quickly shut it down, citing the clear property boundaries and the legal documents proving I owned the entire complex outright. It was a victory, not just for me, but for every tenant who had suffered under her harassment. Just as I thought the ordeal was over, there was one last twist. A neighbor from across the street, who had been watching everything unfold quietly, approached me with a surprising piece of information. She handed me a small envelope and said, "You should see this. It might explain why Karen was so desperate to control your building." Inside was a letter dated years ago, revealing that Karen's HOA was planning a major expansion, trying to annex nearby properties to increase their power and influence. My office complex was the next target in that plan. Suddenly, this wasn't just a personal fight. It was part of a bigger scheme to take over the whole neighborhood. The battle was won for now, but the war was far from over. And I knew I had to be ready for whatever came next. Finding that letter changed everything. It explained Karen's relentless pursuit and her unusual confidence. It wasn't just about rules or parking spots, but a calculated effort to expand her HOA's control. Knowing this made me realize how important it was to stay vigilant and protect not just my property, but the whole community around it. After sharing the letter with my attorney and the city council, they promised to keep a close eye on any further attempts at annexation or harassment. The tenants felt relief too. They no longer worried about unexpected visits or false complaints disrupting their businesses. The office complex finally felt like a safe, stable place again. This whole experience taught me a lot about standing up for what's right, especially when faced with someone trying to misuse power. It showed me how important it is to know your rights and have solid legal backing. Sometimes, the biggest challenges come from unexpected places: neighbors, local groups, even community leaders. But with patience and proof, you can protect what's yours. Looking back, I'm grateful for the support from my tenants, neighbors, and legal team. We faced a lot of tension and uncertainty, but together, we pushed through. It wasn't just about owning a building. It was about defending a space where people work, create, and grow their dreams. If there's one takeaway from this story, it's To never underestimate the power of knowledge and community. Whether you're dealing with an HOA dispute or any kind of property conflict, understanding your rights and staying united makes all the difference. The fight might get tough, but standing your ground can lead to real change. Thanks for following. Along with this story, if you've ever dealt with something similar or have questions about HOAs and property rights, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your experiences. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.